Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. Hi, Haviv. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here.
It is so great to have you this Saturday night, June 14th, just after Shabbat. We're all very domestic. You may hear noises of our children, our washing machines, and all sorts of stuff happening here in the background because this is a real moment, a very Israeli moment here, this Motzei Shabbat, in which Israel is now at war with Iran. So, Haviv, tell me in a few words, what's the mood in your household, at least, or in your neck of the woods?
Kids are happy not to have school for the coming week. All the major events have been canceled. Friday was going to be my son's birthday party. So that was canceled. We're going to take all his buddies to a big park where you do a lot of this, basically a jungle gym for older boys, but it's like this huge, outdoor thing. And that was canceled. There's no bomb shelter nearby. And we got family. We have family in Tel Aviv. We have family called up to the Northern Front. I don't know details. The army Times of Israel, Manny has reported that the army has been mobilizing some units to the north just in case some, leftover Hezbollah or Syrian militias that are loyal to Iran try and help Iran out in this war. I don't know. We're a family that went through, like 100 million other families, if not billions, went through COVID, and then and like all other Israelis, then October 7 and everything that's happened since. So it's crazy. I imagine your family is fairly the same, with one huge exception, which is you actually have kids in the army right now.
That's right. And in fact, I would say that the two soldiers who are home, my daughter is not home. She's part of the Home Front Command, and so she's on call and very much at the ready in another part of the country. But the two soldiers who are at home, it's quite interesting. Every time there's a siren and we're sent to our safe room, they're a little more hesitant, I think, because they actually have faced existential, life-threatening danger in their daily lives. And so for them, they're not getting so riled up over these rockets. But, I try and tell the kids it's kind of like putting on a seatbelt when you're in the car. It's something you have to do, even though statistically speaking, you probably won't get hit by a rocket. But it's something that you do. When I was a little girl in British Columbia, and everyone was so afraid of the Soviet nuclear threat, and it was in the news and it was in the pop culture for just really decades, but you never really thought it would come true. And in so many ways, I kind of feel like that's how Israel has been with this Iran threat, the threat of going to war with Iran. And then here we are, all of a sudden, since between Thursday and Friday, 3 a.m. in the morning, we are at war with Iran. This is not just a simple operation. We are, according to the IDF spokesperson, Effie Defrin, we are at war with Iran, which just blows my mind in so many ways, Haviv. You?
No. In some ways it's startling that this is that great escalation that nobody could imagine, right? Everyone talked about, we listened for 8 years, President Obama say, everything's on the table. I'm making a deal with Iran, but they'd better watch out because everything's on the table. And I don't think anybody on earth believed him. I have never met someone who claimed to have believed him at that time. And I personally, for the last 20 months, have had very, very serious doubts, and I've aired them in public, that Netanyahu has the gumption, is that the right word, to embark on the kind of military escalation. Look, Iran has had a strategy, a very clear strategy, a very obvious strategy. It's been public about it, of surrounding us by proxies, slowly turning up the heat, boiling us alive, so to speak, as they say as the euphemism has it about frogs, and eventually leading all Israeli Jews to run away. And there have been, national security advisors of Khamenei who've said this over the years. That's our strategy. And they created proxies in Syria, and they have proxies in Iraq, and obviously the Houthis they've massively upgraded, and the crown jewel of the proxy system, Hezbollah, and their purpose was, A, to prevent an Israeli war with Iran because they could launch 200,000 rockets and missiles on Israeli cities in that event, and B, their purpose was to constantly, forever harass and create despair among Israelis until Israeli Jews all leave. And that slow-moving war, the Israeli response after October 7 was, we can't have these enemies around us anymore, and we can't have these ongoing threats. We don't know when they're going to explode on us. So all the monsters on all the borders, all the, people talking about our destruction, well, we're going to come for you. And the obvious ending of that theory, that strategy, that vision, that new Israeli consciousness was going to be a war with Iran. And by the way, you and I talked about that 19 months ago. In other words, everybody understood that you start with Hamas, you have to get Hezbollah eventually, you have to go into, the Houthis stepped in, so you have to then cause them very terrible damage. But ultimately it ends in Iran. And so we all knew it. What we didn't know is Netanyahu has the courage. It turns out he absolutely does. And not only does he have the courage, he's done it in the biggest way that the Mossad and the Air Force and the IDF knew how. And now we have to see to it that the costs to Iran are so high for its strategy of slow-moving destruction of us. We're going to ride that escalation curve as high as we can go because we have total escalation dominance. We can ride it much, much higher than they can. And that's pain. That's pain for us. That's pain for them. But at the end of the day, it's that, or they break out to a nuke, and they might. What we learned on October 7 is our enemies cannot be deterred because they have this religious vision. They might actually use it.
Right. And what we learned on October 7th as well is to take what our enemies say seriously, because they actually might follow through with the idea of wiping all Jews off the map. And in fact, Haviv, piggybacking on what you said about this existential threat, just tonight, our IDF Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, said, and I'm quoting from a Channel 12 report, he said, the operation in Iran is an operation to defend the existence of the Jewish people. History will not forgive us if we do not act now. And just to remind our listeners, of course, that the operation, this war, was triggered by the information that Iran could essentially within days create 15 nuclear bombs, that they have enough enriched uranium and the technical know-how to create these 15 nuclear bombs. So Israel is now at war with Iran. The cynicism, however, of why now is so rife throughout international media. I've been reading, of course, the New York Times and all sorts of different international reports. And so many of them are claiming that Israel is dragging the United States into a war, which we're not sure that that's going to happen yet, but that Israel is dragging the United States into a war also because it's in Netanyahu's interest to hold on to his position as the prime minister of Israel. Haviv, Iran has been Netanyahu's pet project, his real cause for the past 20 years. Do you think that one could be so cynical as to see this as a way for Netanyahu to hold on to power?
No. We should say that a great many Israelis, a huge number of Israelis, including some double-digit percentage of the soldiers gone off to Gaza and other fronts, have believed, just so people understand, there's polls we have from months ago that said something around 40%, believe that Netanyahu is dragging out the war so he doesn't face an election when his polling is still bad because of October 7. That is a discourse within Israel. If it's reported in the foreign press, it's often reported by reporters on the ground in Israel who hear it from Israelis. That's a conversation about Gaza. The war against Hezbollah, that fast, smart, intelligence-heavy war against Hezbollah was extremely popular and fast and effective. And what has happened so far with Iran was something years in the making. And we have polling on this. The vast majority of Israelis supported escalating the war to Iran. By the way, in periods when the majority of Israelis, out of distrust of Netanyahu, whether because they didn't think he wanted to end the war in Gaza or they didn't think he could end the war or win the war in Gaza, even if he tried, in periods when a majority of Israelis said the Gaza war should end, a majority of Israelis still said we have to escalate to Iran. Because Iran is an existential threat. And the reason Israelis think Iran is an existential threat is that Iran won't stop saying to Israelis it's an existential threat. And October 7 was a moment of tremendous humility it created in a powerful sense, a whole new Israeli war doctrine that said, we're dumb. We don't understand our enemies. We totally misunderstood an enemy we should have been utterly impenetrated in terms of intelligence and completely aware of and knew everything about. And in fact, Hamas could surprise us at a grand strategic level. What are the chances we have a totally perfect psychoanalysis of the Iranian leadership? Put it this way, how many generations of our children and grandchildren are we willing to gamble on our perfect knowledge and understanding of the Iranian leadership? And the answer after October 7 is exactly zero. And so we have to remove the threat. And it's Iran's fault that it made itself this threat. This is a regime that it's truly astonishing. I mean, it has spent 40 years in power accomplishing nothing, absolutely nothing, except isolating the country, impoverishing its people, oppressing its people, and trying to destroy Israel, and trying to build out some kind of a regional, proxy system of power to fend off Sunni influence or something. I mean, it's just deeply, profoundly silly, ridiculous things for its own religious vision, for its own vision of its own grandeur, for its own sort of cheap kind of saber rattling. And this is true of many dictatorships, but nevertheless, it has utterly ruined Iran. And so a country that for 4 decades has accomplished nothing except these kinds of wars, we're going to assume the worst, and we're going to assume that it's coming for us, and we are incredibly competent and capable, and we're going to. Most Israelis I know, and by the way, even the Israelis, there's some journalists who are deeply, deeply critical of Netanyahu for years, for a generation. And they're having trouble now giving him good, credit for taking this decision, this courageous decision. But even their argument isn't we shouldn't go for Iran. Their argument is we'd be in a better position with this strike if, Trump at Bibi's behest hadn't pulled out of the JCPOA, 6 years ago. Their position is still Netanyahu brought us to a place where we could be doing even better. I don't know Israelis who say Iran is not a genuine existential threat and we don't have to take care of it. And that's what's happening now.
Let's go to a short break.
The law basically assumes that the enemy force you are fighting may not care about your civilians, but it certainly cares about its own civilians. What do we do in a reality where you're dealing with an enemy that the suffering of their civilian population is inherent to their war strategy? Now, that doesn't absolve us of our obligations. Hamas's inhumanity does not absolve us of the obligation to humanity. But the context that it creates, I think, is critical to the conversation, and it's very lacking.
I agree, but when democracies fight back against terror groups, they have to fight on 2 fronts. They have to both fight on the terms that have been laid out by the terror group, and the second thing you have to fight back is by preserving the norms of a democracy. We're forced to ask these moral questions about what we are and what we do, but based on an enemy that is not playing by the rules. But that's what we decide to be a part of by being the family of nations. And as Jews, we say, like every morning in our prayers, we say, Anachnu amcha b'nei britecha. We choose to be the people of God's covenant, meaning we tie ourselves to an aspiration of justice and righteousness.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. Now, Haviv, I don't know what the end of this war will be, but one of the solutions that our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is proposing is essentially for the Iranian people to overthrow the regime. I'm going to quote from something he said yesterday on Friday, and he told Iranians that he hopes Israel's ongoing military operation there will clear the path for you to achieve your freedom. He called the regime evil and oppressive, and he said, our fight is against the murderous Islamic regime that oppresses and impoverishes you. This is your opportunity to stand up and let your voices be heard, said Netanyahu in taped remarks that were broadcast, of course, around the globe. So, Haviv, we just talked about how the regime has indeed basically ruined the country over the past decades. But do you think that the people are ripe to take up this challenge from Netanyahu and indeed throw off the shackles?
The short answer is I don't know. There's good reason to think that yes. The Mahsa Amini protests after the death of this young woman in police custody because she wore her head covering wrong. Back in 2023. Right now, Iran is basically frozen in place. It's basically crippled by massive labor strikes. By truckers is the big one. By farmers, bakers, nurses. In 150 cities, there was a poll of Iranians. I hope I'm saying this correctly, but back in November of 2023, it's the most recent poll I could find. It's not that easy to poll Iranians openly and publicly and then publish them, certainly in the Iranian press. But there was a poll in the Iranian press, which the regime allowed. It was even a regime-affiliated newspaper, in which 92% of Iranians said that the country was in a bad state and they were unsatisfied with the state. A great deal of that is economic, but a great deal of the economic problems have to do with regime policy, with the nuclear program, with sanctions, with an endless war on a country they have no border with and no interests in. And there's another poll that I could find, because we've been looking all this stuff up in the last couple of days, 11% support for the regime among the population, and 60% want regime change and don't think that the country is reformable without regime change. Now, when you actually poll Iranians, or you find these polls of Iranians, assuming they're trustworthy, they say such terrible things about the regime, I suspect that they're accurate. In other words, why would the regime allow it if it's not actually the right data? Because the interest would be the opposite, for them not to show this kind of displeasure. But in as much as we have polling, the polling tells us that a huge amount of the anger and frustration is not even the religious stuff that the regime sort of imposes and enforces. Which is significant, and as I said, the Mahsa Amini protests were all over the country, and there's a lot of anger over religion and over religious oppression. But the number one overwhelming thing is the competence and the economics. The economics of the country have crashed. This is a country with some of the greatest energy reserves on earth. It should be vastly wealthy. And it's also a country with extraordinarily well-educated middle classes that could be producing. In other words, it's not an extraction economy like Saudi Arabia, where there isn't an economy other than the extraction, other than the oil and the gas, etc. It would be a country that would have both the unbelievable talent that produces the Israeli economic productivity and innovation, and the extraction that produces Saudi Arabia, but for this regime. And so there is a tremendous desire among Iranians, as far as we can tell. However, the regime has, I a little bit lied a couple minutes ago when I said the regime has, in fact, basically accomplished nothing in 4 decades, because it has accomplished one thing. And that one thing is the big thing it has accomplished, and it has done it beautifully, extraordinarily well. And that is stay in power. Make sure to build out against vast displeasure by the people, against constant protests of every kind imaginable, economic protests and, women's rights protests and liberal sort of elite protests of certain kinds of very educated elites and working class protests. It has built out mechanisms, whether it is basically regime thugs in a systematic way going out into the streets at the push of a button to beat up any kind of protesters, whether it's co-opting different elites, economic elites, judicial elites, co-opting them into the regime and making sure they're not a threat to the regime. Iran's regime is extraordinary at staying in power. So yes, the people would like it to happen. We've seen videos from Iran, more than 1, more than 5, more than 15. Every one of us has seen videos from Iran of Iranians cheering the Israeli airstrikes. However, can they actually bring down the regime? Only if the Israelis cause so much damage that the regime really struggles to fight back. I don't think that's doable with Israel's set. I'm not an expert on this, but what we're hearing from other experts is that it's not doable with Israel's set of tools, with Israel's set of military capabilities. Could America drive that kind of political opening in Iran if it shatters the IRGC, if it genuinely sort of crushes Fordo to dust, some of these facilities that Israel might not be able to penetrate of the nuclear program? Possibly.
Okay, Haviv, we are being told by the Iranian regime to buckle up and get ready for another wild night here in Israel. I hope your safe room is tidy and has plenty of mattresses for your whole family. And I wish you great safety until we speak again, which I really hope will be very soon, Haviv.
Thanks, Amanda. You too. Stay safe.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment hopefully soon. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next time, shalom.